Okay, today's topic is the art and science of psychiatry. We will hear from a practicing psychiatrist who will speak on one of the most common conditions he consults on. Our speaker is Dr. Mohamed Dattu, a graduate of the University of Toronto, who finished his medical degree and internship in internal medicine, followed by training in psychiatry. Dr. Dattu has served as a medical director of a multidisciplinary practice, as well as a large community psychiatric clinic serving Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Currently, he is in private practice in Philadelphia. He is a member of the Board of Psychiatric Educators for the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Society and has served on the Board of Research and Public Education for the publication Current Psychiatry. He has written several commentaries for research articles. The bio is much longer, but I've shortened it. Dr. Dattu, we look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Brother Nazmul. I wanted to extend, first of all, a very deep appreciation to Nazmul for inviting me to do this. We talked it over when I was visiting my parents in the summer, and he approached me about doing something like this. And I think that the platform that you have developed for dissemination of information that's very crucial for our community to be aware of is just a fantastic way of reaching out to our community, having them know what kind of resources are available to them and who they can go to for different kind of questions and help. So again, I want to thank you for that. And also for everybody taking time out of their Sunday. I know there's so many other things you could do, but I'm very appreciative that everybody's here. And so the subject that is today we're going to talk about is really something that I think is a combination of art and science. Something that a lot of the scientific community is trying to over-scientificize, if there's such a word, but there's also an art component to it, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit during the course of the presentation. But you know, when we all think of psychiatry, you know, we have various images coming through our mind, I'm sure. And so if we could look at the next slide here, sometimes people might be thinking of a psychiatrist in a very different way from what is typically available. So if you could have the next slide there. There we go. So maybe some of us find that, you know, psychiatrists or doctors in that category are people who do these kind of wild experiments on people. Here's another one, Mr. Fraser Crane, whom we're all familiar with. But, you know, the psychiatry, if we progress to the next slide, psychiatry really started a long time ago. As you could see, you know, 6th century BC by somebody named Al-Kamaran. He's one of the first people who linked emotions with functioning in the brain. Very rudimentary understanding of different mental health conditions, but it goes back that long ago. So about 1400 years ago. If we could look at the next slide, please, as well. Confucius, many of us may have heard of him. He also was born, as we could see, 5th century, and he looked at very different aspects of mental health functioning, which are things that actually are very much researched today in terms of social and behavioral manifestations, and some of his teachings are still even in use today. Next slide, please. And now to look a little bit more closer at our community, here's somebody, Ibn Zakaria, born in 840, as you could see. And he was really the first person from the Islamic world who looked at brain health, brain function, and was actually the first person to investigate and practice psychology and psychotherapy. And he proved to be a very instrumental and inspirational figure for a lot of people that followed him down the road. He's considered one of the founding fathers of medicine. Perhaps other people have looked at Hippocrates, who lived before him, but nonetheless, this is a pivotal role of somebody in our Islamic background who contributed to the field. Next slide, please, Brother Nazmul. And then some of us may have heard of the name Avicenna, who one of the most famous physicians of the medieval times. Born in the year 980, major contributions in many areas, primarily in other medical sectors like cardiology and cardiac drugs. But again, he looked at something that's very, very profoundly, deeply human experience, about anxiety, about the death, people. He even looked at people who had near-death experiences, but also about people who were about to die, and looked at the mind-body not as separate entities, but something that is an integrated whole in how one can affect the other. So that's a little bit of a background. And the person that we most recognize today is Sigmund Freud, born in the mid 1800s, died 1940. He was a neurologist, but he's the person who we most recognize with the face of psychiatry, at least in the West. And his major contribution was not so much in psychiatry the way I'm going to describe it, but in an area called psychoanalysis. Which we'll talk a little bit about, but it's not the main thrust of my talk. But if we go to the next slide, this might be a little bit of an idea. He may be a character. I know I'm familiar with him because I grew up watching these cartoons. And we have one of each at our house. We have an id and a superego who happen to be a boy and a girl in that respectively. But it is supposed to be a primal drive that doesn't have any boundaries, does what it wants to do. Superego is the part of our brain and our personality, talks about the ultimate in ethics and being right, and then dad in the middle trying to coordinate those two. That's where Freud started to help out with the id, the superego, and the ego. And everybody has these inherent aspects to their human nature. So you can see very quickly there that id is that completely unrestrained kid. Does what they want to do. That's the part of us that just has hunger drives, deep intimacy drives, etc., uncontrolled. I just want to do what I want to do. Superego is the part of us that may step in and say, this is not right. You should make better decisions. Slow down. Don't do this. You should be thinking on a higher level. And then we have to negotiate those two parts where we come to the ego. And even though Homer Simpson is not always the best example of an ego, he's more like an id, just like his kid. There are many times where a dad will step in and try to kind of, make things work out in a reasonable fashion. That goes on in our minds all the time. We might say, I want to eat that whole cake. Part of us says, don't eat anything because you're trying to lose weight. And then the ego part, the ego part will step in and say, you know what, I'll have a slice. That's kind of reasonable. So that's kind of where Freud's major work went. He didn't have Bart Simpson as a reference, as you can imagine, like I do. So it's easier for me to talk about it. But that's where his contribution came in. And again, I won't be getting too much into this aspect of it. Certainly it can come up in the Q&A. But if we look at the next slide, we're going to start getting into a little bit about what this talk is about. We've all heard about the term psychologist, psychiatrist, and well, what does this mean? I mean, psychology and psychiatry have a lot of connections, a lot of areas where they meet and intersect in both describing human experience and describing abnormal experiences that lead to disability. There's some difference in how they approach these things. Psychology takes a look at these particular issues primarily from a perspective of personality development, primarily from an area of behavioral development and child development, as well as looking at how those particular dysfunctional beliefs, dysfunctional outward behaviors, and dysfunctional thoughts can be modified through behavioral modification, cognitive therapy, what's called dialectical therapy. So it's a lot of therapy, talk therapy, and really asks for the patient to do a lot of introspective work. Psychiatry starts to differ and it diverges in some ways when it gets to not only analyzing these things, but actually looking at them from a biological perspective to say, is there something wrong with the way the person's brain functions? Is there something biologically going on here that's not necessarily only in the person's control or only related to their developmental milestones and trajectories or their relationships? And it tries to look at this from a perspective of categorizing things as illness or health and looking at treatments through various categories. For example, medications, therapy, something called neuromodulation, which we're also going to get into a little bit later. So hopefully that, will give you a bit of an idea. Let's look at the next slide, please, Brother Nazmul. So how do we categorize disease? I mean, there are many ways for us to kind of look at people and, as doctors, even within our community, we might kind of say like, that person, they don't appear to be interacting with anybody. They look very withdrawn. They look very sad. They used to be very talkative and happy. I wonder what's going on. So some of these conditions may be a manifestation of something the person is struggling with, whether it is serious depression, serious anxiety, and it starts now outwardly manifest in their behaviors. So what the people who started studying psychiatry in a more organized fashion, in a disciplined fashion, realized that, we can't just be going around using our own descriptions and our own kind of ideas of what is considered impaired behavior and what is not. And that's where we started to find the beginnings of modern psychiatry as we know it today. And in the United States, somebody named Benjamin Rush, a doctor, was a person who actually founded American psychiatry. He categorized mental illness in terms of the type of manifestation of the problem, but he looked at it particularly as a mental illness that was a function of a disease of the brain, rather than, for example, in the past, it was thought to be demonic or some kind of judgment on the person's character or her behavior. So he removed that aspect of it and tried to look at it more objectively. And the first book of this particular manual, which lists all of the conditions and what they consist of and so forth, came out in the 1950s, and it was called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It was initially used for research publications, but it eventually very seamlessly translated into clinical practice. So it was used to try and see what patients met certain criteria to be involved in clinical trials and trials to be able to describe illnesses and so forth. But it was valuable enough that it started to become used in the everyday clinical interaction with the patient, to look at them and to characterize if there are any problems they're experiencing and so forth. And about a new edition comes out about every 15 to 20 years. So if we look at the next slide, we started the DS with that one in the early 50s, and now we're looking the one that's currently available now, DSM-5. We started out, as you can see in the first edition, the picture that you just saw, with 60 disorders, which you would think that's a lot, already, for how many things can be wrong with a person's mind and their behavior and emotions. Today, we've gone up to 157. The version just before this, which was out about 15 to 20 years ago, it came out, had 172. So the researchers and doctors who started to put together the edition that we're working on now realized that every time a new edition came out, another 30 or 40 conditions were added. And it started to get to a point where people who were starting to now get involved and say, wait a minute, are we starting to become overly critical of what might be normal human behavior, normal human emotions? Are we trying to use the microscope too much to make everything a possible condition or a possible illness? So there's a lot of debate going on between the DSM-4 committee that put the prior one together and the DSM-5 committee that put this one together. And they finally decided they need to pare it down, because they were going to go from 172 to over 190, but they actually scaled back quite a bit more to 157. The number is not so much important, other than to say it's something we should be aware of, that mental health is a real condition, has real profound implications for our community, our Shia community, as well as the larger community we live in. And that's what the thrust of it is that I want us to understand today. So we could go to the next slide, please. Here's the interesting point that I really want to bring home to all of us. These conditions that we're going to talk about, are global. They're global, they're international, they're everywhere. They're in not only the communities around us or in other religious sects and people practices, it's within our cultures, within our religious organizations and so forth. Not in a way to make us feel stigmatized, like, oh my God, there's something wrong with us. No, in a way to make us understand that these conditions that people experience go beyond a particular group of people, or how we were raised, or how we were acculturated to our surroundings as we move from continent to continent, in many of the people's cases who are attending today. A lot of these things transcend that. They go beyond that and have a lot to do with not only those things I just mentioned, like the environment, upbringing, and so forth, but also circumstances that happen in a person's individual life, as well as their inherent internal biology, what we call in the DNA. And so these conditions, as we could see, the numbers are staggering. Just in the United States, I have some numbers coming up about Canada as well, but just in the United States alone, we could see that one of the most common conditions that I see in my practice almost every single day, without doubt, anxiety disorders. And that's almost a 2-to-1 ratio of anxiety disorders to depressive disorders. We're going to focus on depressive disorders today, and I'll tell you a little bit why as we progress through the slides. But just look at the staggering number of people. 50 million people in the United States have an anxiety disorder. By disorder, we specifically mean it's causing enough impairment in their functioning that by definition of what we call a disease state, it's causing suffering. Some people carry it off really well. Some people are struggling a lot, but they maintain a very calm outward demeanor. You can't even tell. Behind closed doors, they may be very much struggling. Some people struggle so much that they are even struggling in the workplace and people can see it. But this is the breakdown of conditions that we're seeing here. And we also have another whole host of conditions, which we're not going to touch on today, but they're in the area of things like bipolar disorders, psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, which is a minority, but it's still a very large minority, less than 1%. And this, again, is across all cultures, all religions, etc. And PTSD, which is something that used to be described in people who came back from war. They would have very severe reliving experiences and nightmares about what they experienced in the combat area. And they would actually be living it out in their day and in their mind after they left. It would be so intrinsically destructive to their inner core. PTSD now transcends only battle and war. People in very severe car accidents, people who've had very traumatic experiences in other areas of their life, etc., could experience this particular condition as well. Let's look at the next slide, please. So here's a little bit about Canada, where I think most of us are living. I know when I was looking at the people signing on, I want to say hello to my relatives in England. I know my sister got to you and you guys are staying up to watch this, so I hope it's going to be worth your time. But the statistics for Canada shows that, almost 30% of adults at one point in their life are going to experience some kind of mental illness. And in overall, in any 1 year, almost 20% of people, including children, experience mental illness. Again, remember, illness in the sense of it's causing dysfunction. Yeah. Okay, majority of us, I think, are at least in our 40s or above. Almost half of us will have had some kind of mental illness, whether it's depression problems, whether it's anxiety problems. And I'm going to get into a little bit later, what is the type of depression that I look at in terms of this is a real problem that needs a medication intervention, therapy intervention, versus what is maybe part of life, if you will, depression. Because we all go through situations where we're sad, we're grieving, we're down. But does all of it qualify as a diagnostic condition? And the answer is no, but we will come to that. So by the age of 40, almost half of us will have had some kind of mental illness, most likely. You know what? The most common ones, as we saw, are the ones we've listed, anywhere from 50% or so, or 50 million people to 25 million people. So 20%, 10% of the population, mood or anxiety disorders being the most common. Now, the important thing in Canada is that the medical system there is really designed in a way, and actually most of the world is designed on the model of what they'd call socialistic medicine, which is almost like a dirty word here in the United States. But I think the important point being is that the rest of the planet has kind of figured out that the government needs to step in to provide that kind of a comprehensive program for healthcare. In the United States, it's different. You either have insurance or you go on to what's called Medicaid, which is like welfare, but there are about 50 million Americans who don't qualify for Medicaid because they make too much money, but they don't have a job or they don't make enough to qualify to purchase insurance, so they have nothing. And so they fall through the gaps a lot. And there are clinics and practices to help people like that, but that's one of the biggest things. And I believe one of the doctors much earlier in the programs that are being presented spoke about the difference in the medical systems between Canada and the USA. Next slide, please. So what is it about the depression that's so worrisome? Well, interestingly enough, and I mean this interestingly enough in not a, that's really cool, but interesting enough in a kind of a sobering way. Depression is a condition that takes lives, right? It talks about such a depth of despair, such a depth of loss of meaning in life, such a depth of a sense of disconnectedness and failure, that a person feels like there is no hope anymore in my life for me to try to make things better. Nothing will change. And hopelessness as a particular aspect of depression is one of the scariest things I hear patients tell me. And I'll lead up to why that is so. But as you could see, almost 20 million people in a year in the US are going to be suffering from depression. Canada, it's about 25%. So very big numbers. If you think about the hundreds of millions of people that live in the country, and look at how many people are suffering with this one condition, pretty staggering numbers. Now, our community, there was actually a study done in a fairly well-respected journal, and I have it quoted there, JAMA Psychiatry, just in July, looked specifically at Muslim communities. And just read that. I don't want to just paraphrase it, but of interest to our community, a recent study showed that self-identified Muslims, people who said, I'm a Muslim, they identified as Muslim, were 2 times more likely to have a history of a suicide attempt compared to the other religious groups in that particular study. So they looked at Christians, they looked at Jewish people, they looked at Buddhists, etc. That's a very, very staggering, very sobering. That's why I put the word sobering there, number. We might feel we're immune to this. And I understand. I mean, that's a very tragic outcome if somebody dies by suicide, certainly. Or even the fact that they went so far as to attempt to take their own life. We may almost never hear of these. Somebody like me does hear about them because I specifically ask for them. I specifically try to explore those things. But majority of us in the community, we're never going to hear this. Nobody's going to come up and tell us like, oh God, you know, uncle or mom or dad, you know, I tried this, you know. Oftentimes they may just be very ashamed about it. They may not seek medical help. There have been a failed attempt, you know. One of the key questions I ask patients is, when you did this, how did you feel when you came out of it and you realized it didn't happen? And majority of patients tell me, I was so thankful that I didn't die. I really was so thankful nothing happened. The very scary patients to me are the ones who say, I was really disappointed. I thought to myself, I am such a mess. I can't get anything right. I can't even do this correctly. That's how much of a loser I am. That's a very scary thing to hear a person say, because if you think about human nature, every instinct in us is to survive. You know, it's interesting. There was a study done many years ago of people who were leaving an emergency room who had initially gone in saying that they were suicidal and left either because they didn't get the medications they wanted. Oftentimes they want pain medications, or they'll say something to get some medications. But invariably, so many of these people who were leaving the ER would look both ways before crossing the street. And you might think somebody who doesn't care if they live or die is probably not even going to notice there's a car coming at them. It's so inborn in us to need and want to survive. Imagine somebody going counter to that instinct to say, I actually want to take my own life. And the offshoot of this is when I look at firefighters and policemen, you know, when you see a burning building, when you know that there's a violence in a neighborhood, my instinct, and I'm sure many, I hope, is to flee. These people have to actually go in. How much do they have to overcome to be able to go into those situations? So that's a very scary thing that I think is important to be aware of. Next slide, thank you. Now, here, is all depression clinical depression? Are they all the same thing? No. There's a lot of misunderstanding and confusion. A lot of the terminology we use, people don't walk around saying, man, I feel like I have hypertension, or, you know, man, I feel like, you know what, I'm hyperglycemic, I'm hypoglycemic, which is more often. They don't say those things, but a lot of people in our everyday term, they say, man, I'm pretty depressed, or man, I'm anxious, man, I had a panic attack, I had an anxiety attack. So a lot of these terms can become used and misunderstood in the general population. They're not the same thing. And we've all used those kind of terms. Clinical depression is actually a very different thing. It's a disorder. And we're going to get to this on the next slide here. And let's go to that next one. Here's depression. This is somebody we might all see or have experienced, right? Depression as a clinical entity has been defined through all of those books that you saw the pictures of the covers. Over those decades, the doctors, the scientists, the psychologists who study this condition have come to an agreement of what are some of the essential things that we need to see, we need to elicit from the patient that suggests there is an actual medical depression going on, a clinical depression. And they've identified through tens of thousands of people over the years that you have to have at least some of these conditions. One of them must at least be anhedonia, which is a fancy word that means a complete loss of joy or sense of pleasure in anything. Even things that you normally would enjoy just don't bring you a sense of happiness anymore. I see patients telling me, you know, I don't even find reading enjoyable. I used to be able to read, and it was my most passionate hobby, and I don't want to read anymore. I just don't have that desire. Or I don't listen to music. I don't play with my kids. I don't do gardening. Things that are genuine passion, they feel nothing from it anymore. Or a very profoundly depressed mood. We all say depression. I'm depressed. I feel bummed out. I feel down. This is like a depression of a despairing value, a deep, deep, inherently ingrained depression. So one of those two has to be present. Let's look at the next slide here. And it's going to talk about some of the other factors, some of the other symptoms that are associated with, highly correlated with a depressed state in light of the first two that must be there, one of those two. So a lot of these things, I term them dysregulation, and we could look at many. Energy dysregulation, sleep, weight, and appetite. People talk about difficulty concentrating, excessive or inappropriate guilt. Psychomotor dysregulation is just another way of describing a person may move very slowly. They kind of, you ask them things and they're thinking very slowly, they speak slowly, or they're very anxious, restless, fidgety, nervous. So these are things that are very, very common. Now, many of us may have experienced some of these at any one time. So the key thing here is to try and narrow the lens a little bit, to not overdiagnose. We have to say you have to have those first two that we talked about, right? The anhedonia or the depressed mood, plus any 5 of these is typically the way it goes. That and the timeline is 2 weeks. If in a 2 weeks, continuous 2 weeks, you've experienced these kind of symptoms, sometimes even the thought of, I just don't want to live. Very frightening. It's a depressive disorder. And we might think, well, the rest of my body's fine. What's wrong with me? I'm fine. I just have to talk myself out of it. For the people that works for, that's great. Not all of us have that capacity to be able to talk ourselves out of it. And so that's where psychiatry becomes helpful, because it looks at these conditions as an individual thing. Yes, we do population studies, but every patient who comes into the room to see me is an individual person, is not part of a statistic. Yeah. So this is the feeling one patient told me, and that's why I thought this picture would be pretty appropriate. This sense of drowning in despair is what he described it as. And I was very amazed. I found this picture. He said, it's almost like I'm trying to reach for help, for somebody to throw me a lifeline, but I'm not getting it. And it feels like, and this person has been struggling with this for about 3.5 months. And it was leading to impairment in the marriage. The person, lost their job in addition to all these other things. And we'll talk about some of these factors. Let's look at the next slide, please, here. And by the way, that last bit there, suicide, the key point being depression. Thank you. Depression can kill. Depression is not just a state of mind where you actually don't want to do anything or don't like anything. Depression can be enough of a derangement in brain functioning that a person can take their life. Now think about heart attacks, right? Think about cancers. Think about an aneurysm in somebody's brain. Think about infectious diseases. All of these things kill, right? Your brain in these kind of conditions, people have committed suicide. So very, very scary condition to be mindful of. Not everybody does this, but we need to be aware of how important it is to screen for this, right? So next slide, please. Thank you. So we look at, okay, what how does this happen to us? We're not born depressed. Certain diseases we can understand. Okay, diabetes, it happened to me. My dad had it. My mom had it. I put on weight, etc. Certain cancers can develop because of environmental exposures, toxins, things we ate. Sometimes a lot of them are also genetically inherited and so forth. There's certain syndromes and conditions, etc. What about depression? Somebody could have a great life. They have a nice house. They have everything they need. They're integrated in the community, right? How could they get depressed? Well, what's going on here? We're going to see that there's more to depression than meets the eye, right? Depression is not something we can always see. Broken arm, yeah, we can see you have a hard time, playing golf. What about depression? You look great, man. Why are you just not hitting the golf ball anymore? What's going on? Why are you staying away from people at the mosque? So-and-so used to really talk with us a lot. And now I see they kind of come in and just leave. What's going on here, right? It has to do with genetics, which we get from our mom and dad, right? Our parents, and environment. And you could see examples there. Genetics is very, very precisely described and determined. The funny thing is about depression, the genetics are not as precise as I say there. So there are a lot of candidate genes which may predispose to depression, but nothing very specifically identified. There's some candidates, but not too many. But look at the environment, how much of a difficulty it can play, how much of a big role. Abuse, isolation, stressful situation. How many of us emigrated to the countries we're staying in, right? And I think of my parents when they moved to Canada, I was born in Iran and they had a happy life. My mom would always tell me we had a great life in Africa. It was very simple. We didn't have a lot, but we had a sweet life. And we moved to Western countries and everybody has to get a job. Everybody's driving in traffic. There are a lot of people that didn't understand my parents. They made fun of them, getting used to a culture we're foreign to, and we're seen as a threat to them and they're seen as a threat to us. How much psychological pain, suffering do people go through when they're immigrants in a new country, escaping from persecution even, perhaps, in their own country? So these are environmental factors that can play with the genetics to cause the expression of these kind of conditions. Medical problems, and these are something that we can go to the doctor and get tested. Our thyroid, adrenal dysfunction, certain type of cancers may present that way. Almost every single medical illness, rheumatological conditions. There may be a lot of people in our community who have rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, etc. A lot of medical conditions predispose a person to developing depression. And you might say, well, look, you have this condition, of course you're going to feel depressed. Understood. But the kind of depression I'm talking about here, if not adequately treated or screened for and treated, actually almost invariably leads to worse outcomes for those primary conditions that the doctors are trying to also treat. So the arthritis is worse, becomes worse, not just because the person's depressed that it gets worse, but biologically, the arthritis itself, the condition becomes worse. Heart disease, heart attacks, predispose people to getting depression. Outcomes of those kind of studies, always when a person has depression, the way I described it, their outcomes are worse. Cancers, outcomes are worse. Not to universally so, but the trend and the majority of the numbers show that. So that's why depression does play a fundamental role in not only being able to help other medical conditions do better, but certain medical conditions themselves may in turn cause depression. And substance use, which is an area of big concern around the world, particularly where I live in Philadelphia and many parts of the US and Canada as well. And this comes to things like cocaine, marijuana, opiate medications, pain medications. People can abuse even medications that are used for legitimate purposes and then develop problems secondary to that. Next slide, please. So here's the statistics, and this is also very frightening. And here we see a gentleman, as a typical patient I may be getting, that I talk to, oftentimes there's a lack of hope, complete hopelessness. Look at the numbers here, okay? So the Center for Disease Control said that since the 18-year period, so say from 2000 to 2017, the number of suicides has increased by over 30%. That's kind of scary to see that. Look at this next one. 10th leading cause of death among Americans in 2016. And it's the second leading cause of death in people under the age of 35. When you think, look, you're at the prime of your life, you're working, you're making money, you're young, you have your health, you have friends, you have everything going for you. Yeah, look at what's going on there. Scary numbers. Now, a lot of this could be, yes, secondary to substance abuse. A lot of this could be due to the environmental factors where they were being abused, right? But nonetheless, the numbers are pretty shocking here. Looking at the next one, you know, just before the 2020, CDC looked at the suicide rate and estimated that every 11 minutes or so, somebody's taking their own life. I can't even imagine that. It's just, I can't even imagine the time we've talked here, there might have been 2 people that already took their life. Yeah. And those people, look at the numbers here. This is where depression becomes very important to screen for, to ask about, to not have any kind of stigma about discussing. 2/3 of these people practically had clinical depression. Clinical depression meaning people I see in my office. Now, how many of those people sought help? Studies show usually less than half of them sought help. Maybe 40% sought help, you know. So let's look at the next slide here. This hits every culture, every religion, every demographics, as we talked about a few slides ago. Looking at Canada, 4,100 deaths in 2017. These are some of the more recent statistics I got. 9th leading cause of death, right? So we have heart disease and cancer, lung cancer being the 1 and 2. You know, there's motor vehicle deaths, there's deaths from other medical conditions, other types of cancers, you know, diabetes-related deaths, etc. 9th leading cause of death, deaths that are preventable, as are some of those other ones, don't get me wrong. But this is a person actively taking their own life. And it could have been prevented with better screening, less stigma. Stigma happens not just in our community, but, you know, I'm not feeling badly that, oh, because even the North American culture we live in still stigmatizes mental health. So of course, many of us will feel that much more reluctant to discuss it. Let's look at the next slide here. Notice that gentleman is somewhat elderly, and here's a slide showing that. It doesn't exclude any age groups. This is across age groups. Even as young, believe it or not, I heard of one of my patients was telling me about how their niece, it was, this is going several years back. She was 12 years old and very sad story, but was being mercilessly bullied in school. And one day just, you know, saw something on a TV where somebody took a bottle of aspirin. And the movie was showing that this person was rushed to a hospital, but, you know, ended up dying. This kid did that. And it was very tragic. She took her own life at the age of 12. So it spans all ages. It's not very common in that age group, of course, thank God, you know, but it is in all age groups. And people are getting to the point where they're desperate, but there's no hope, right? And then they feel like there's nothing else that I can do to help me. And we'll talk about how community, in terms of a nurturing, secure, accepting, loving community, can give a lot of these people hope, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Let's look at the next slide, please. How are we doing with time, Brother Nazmul? We okay?
You're good. We are good. Don't worry.
Okay.
Continue.
All right. So a lot of us, I'm only starting to watch some of these now. Game of Thrones. My wife has been really asking me for the longest time, and I just never got into it. So I just started watching it. So some of us may remember this particular episode. This young man in the middle, who's at the prime of his life, King Joffrey, was poisoned by his wife, the lady just off to the left over there. And in case you notice that really short guy in the back, he's actually one of the royalty that was in the movie. But anyways, the idea being here that what is the difference in how males and females think about and commit suicide, take their life? Well, men are much more likely than women to actually succeed. And they actually use more lethal means, and they're more likely to actually attempt. So is it something in the male genetics? That study is actually, that's questions up for debate. Somebody actually asked me if I wanted to participate in a study to look into that. But what is it about men and males? And it's, part of it is thought to be related to evolution. Part of it is thought to be related to the cultural expectations of males over females. Part of it is thought to be hormonally driven, testosterone and what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So there are many reasons that could be there. And they choose more lethal means. For example, in the US, it could be using a gun or hanging, and a lot of times females will use overdoses, but here's the thing. It's funny, like this lady, if Joffrey had his choice of taking his own life, he would not have poisoned himself like his wife just did. So his expression might be a combination of, I can't believe my wife poisoned me, and wait a minute, I don't look like a man, I'm poisoning myself, I should be using a firearm. So who knows? But here's a key factor. Though he's a young person doing this, seniors are not exempt from this. And it's also statistics in that age category, though they're not as likely to attempt taking their own life. And some of that has been thought to be related to an understanding, a maturing, a sense of equanimity and wisdom that allows them to continue living life, particularly after their spouse dies, right? But nonetheless, it can happen. And we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of something we might see anytime, maybe not so much with COVID now, right? At the mosque, but in our house, if we've gathered with family, they should have had something with everybody wearing a mask, but I guess you have to lift it to eat. So I guess they couldn't do that there. But we could see, hey, look, everybody's part of this equation. We're all a large human family. No culture is really exempt from heart disease. No culture is exempt from cancers. No culture is exempt from divorce and infectious diseases and unemployment and poverty. And so no culture, no demographic group is exempt from some of these very painful conditions. And you could see where it's increasing steadily over the last 10 years, that more careful measures are being done and statistics are being followed in minority communities, in people who have struggling with gender dysphoria, as well as people living in places more remote from cities, so more rural communities, because of less opportunity. A lot of times that comes down to less opportunity, also more lethal means. More guns are prevalent out in the countryside over here, rural areas, than in urban settings. Unemployment is higher out there. Drug use is higher out there. Less opportunities for people is higher out there. Though they sometimes tend to have tighter communities centered around their religious affiliations, whether it's church or something else, it's still a very small community with not enough support many times. Next slide, please. How about us? As I said, this hits all of us. And what's happening? Are we catching it? And unfortunately, the answer is no. And I don't want this to feel like a guilt trip. This is not at all my intention. The intention here is for us to educate and discuss in open debate in an open forum, and for us to become informed as a community that these things, which maybe a lot of times, and I've heard my mom say tales about, we thought so-and-so when they were growing up in East Africa had the devil in them, shaitan, right? And funny enough, initially that's how schizophrenia was viewed here in the United States in the Salem witch trials that happened in Salem, Massachusetts, I believe it is. So those kind of things, do filter down through the generations in the community. And sometimes because mental health conditions are difficult to really understand or catch them, we're not seeing them, we're not catching them, not because we're purposely being ignorant or turning a blind eye. Sometimes that happens in our community and other communities. Sometimes people want to distance themselves from other people they know or family members, etc. It happens. But we're not catching it for many reasons, And stoicism is basically saying, I'm strong, I can put up with anything, we're not going to complain about anything, we don't talk about these things. And for us, the cultural taboo and religious injunctions. So those are many reasons why these things may not be openly discussed. I don't want to turn tables. I don't want to say religion, hey, that's useless. It's blocking us from treating depression. No, that's not the case. Cultural taboos can be playing a role. Stoicism, again, not a guilt trip, but for us to be a bit more aware and open to how different things may contribute to this kind of insular experience with these conditions. Next, please. I wanted to include all sorts of people's pictures. It's interesting when Google is amazing, you could Google, I want to see a Muslim woman posing as a depressed patient, and you get about 200 pictures. I want to find a picture of a young African-American male who looks like he's depressed. Bang, another 500 pictures. So Google has a lot, and a lot of these pictures, obviously, they're on open source. You could find them. But here's some important information. Who are the people that tend to get this a lot? And you can see it varies everywhere from 18 to about 20% across all age groups from 18 to 65. But one of the things here is, the younger the age group, that 18 to 29, it seems to be pretty high. And we saw that, depression is a big factor, risk factor for suicidal attempts. And we saw that in that younger age group, 30% of the people had committed or attempted suicide before. But again, our seniors are not exempt. People my age, 45 to 64. So you're going to have to guess where I am in that range, okay? But 45 to 64, and then a lot of our children, and young adults may have clinical depression, and we may not be catching it. Here's an important thing that kind of leads again to the idea of possible genetics playing a role. And by genetics, I mean, for the other, people who are hearing about it, about the neuroendocrine axis that may be playing a role here, but also moms have tremendous emotional, psychological, environmental stressors, because not only are they primarily the caregivers at home, they take care of everything at home. They work outside the home, and they give birth. I mean, they have to go through that 9 months of caring for a child within their body. So it's a tremendous amount of emotional, psychological stress that's been there from time immemorial, and so they're about twice as likely, starting from a very young age. I mean, just when they're about to hit teenage years, we start seeing it clinically. Now, the age least likely, we could see there's a bit of a gap there from 30 to 44. Why is that? Part of it has to do is that, again, it's a little bit counter to what I may have said before, like, oh my God, you're a young person, why are you trying to hurt yourself? Well, the fact is that most of the people in that range do tend to have, you have the job, you have the car, you have friends, you have family, you're connected, you're traveling, you're experiencing life. What's going on here? Why you're depressed? Well, they also, because they're less likely to get depressed overall, they also have the lower suicide risks. But you still need to screen. Next slide, please.
Just to let you know, timing-wise, if you can wrap up in the next 2-3 minutes, that would be great.
Absolutely. Good. I'm glad we're on time. Okay. So next slide here.
Oh, dear.
Oh, okay.
There we go. We'll have to try this again. So sorry.
Just for the other people out there, we were trying to use my computer, which unfortunately I couldn't get it to work for me to be able to manage the slides. It's that taboo I described earlier. So Nazmul Bhai, to take it over. So can we do something about this? The next slide, yes. We have to look at our relationships, our bonds with our friends, our family, our community, work-life balance. A lot of us tend to work more and do less with our family and have less time for developing those bonds that are important. The typical things: rest, exercise, nutrition, seeing your doctor for your physical health. Important factor here: meditation, spirituality, prayer. Why does this become important? There are a lot of studies done that show that people who are spiritually aware or practicing spirituality, meditation, and prayer, and we could see how that's important in our community, find great meaning in life's sufferings through those kind of experiences. So all of these factors give meaning to the fabric of our life. And you can imagine when a lot of these things go off, relationships, work, you don't like your work, you work too much, you're not in tune with spirituality in any way, you're not in taking care of yourself physically, you're going to be more likely to have significant problems that lead to the clinical depression, not just sadness, but the clinical depression we talked about. And then those other risk factors start coming into play depending on age, your prior history, abuse, etc. will start to increase the risk of other pretty bad adverse outcomes. So next slide, please. We look at treatments, and I'm sure this will come up in our discussion, so I won't belabor this at the moment, but therapies that we talked about, there are many kinds, and medications, whole slew of medications out there that we can certainly talk about. But Prozac is one of the first one that maybe most of us will have heard in the popular media, but there are medications way before that, actually, and newer ones that even came out just about 3-4 years ago, and they're in the development now. Different kinds of neuromodulation treatments, something called ECT, which was started in the mid-70s, followed by something called vagus nerve stimulation, which is a fairly invasive procedure in early 2000, which is useful for unipolar and bipolar depression. And if people have questions about that, we could talk about it. TMS is a much newer mode of it. The way we look at it is kind of a refined version of ECT that came out in the mid-70s. And that treats conditions like MDD, which is major depressive disorder, and something called OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which falls into an anxiety category, which I didn't really touch on today. So there are many, point being, there are many modes of treatment. Treatment is available. These conditions are known, have been studied, and help is there. So to never feel you're hopeless and there's nowhere you can turn. If you can't turn to people at home, it's understood. Not everybody can do that. But there are other mental health professionals who hold confidentiality very strictly as part of their code of ethics, who you can turn to for the much needed help you may be needing, suffering from these conditions. Next slide, please. Okay, what do we do? How do we move on forward? Well, we have to look at mental health from the perspective of compassion. This doesn't mean necessarily enabling people like, oh, you're feeling bad, let's enable you to feel bad and coddle you too much and make you, that's a different thing. We're talking about trying to understand where that person's coming from and show them we understand and that we'd be willing to help them or support them in any way they might find helpful or guide them in directions that they need. Let's get rid of the stigma. Nobody wants to have heart disease. I get it, but it's easier to talk about. Nobody wants to have psychotic disorders like schizophrenia or depression. It's somehow a bit difficult to talk about. But the mistake there is they're real conditions that have a high burden on the person's life if we shut them off from expressing it, awareness, and that really segues into the awareness aspect. Let's become aware. That's part of what this talk is about, not an exhaustive treatise on depression or mental health, but awareness that these things exist even in our community, and screening. And that's something that could be formalized, or it could be done informally, and we could talk both about those things. Here, most primary care doctors are actually mandated to screen patients who go into them at certain ages. And when you tell the doctor I'm depressed, they're kind of mandated to really screen. So we could talk about that and how it could be perhaps implemented one day in a broader context in our community. I believe that might be the end of the slides, Brother Nazmul, if you want to check one more. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is any one of our families, right? We've all seen people like this. This is us growing up, So the idea is it hits our community. It hits everybody at home. It's our family, mothers, brothers, sisters, cousins, so have you, And again, we all go through sadness. We all go through really down days, maybe down weeks. But is it clinical depression? It has to meet certain criteria. But whatever you're feeling that to you is very difficult and painful, it's okay to ask for help and see somebody if you don't want to see anybody that you're too close to at home and you want some of that personal space. But the good thing is to know, again, depression, I should say is not a good thing, but I was looking at the last line, but depression is a killer. It's like the heart disease of the brain. It's like the cancer of the brain. It's like the exploding bomb. It's a killer. People take their lives, and we need to be aware of the possibility that this exists all around us. But there are a lot of ways, that's where the good news is, to really help improve the outcomes, outreach, and so forth. So I hope that's a little bit of information in this short amount of time. I'm sure there are going to be some questions, but I think maybe I should turn it over to you, Brother Nazmul.
Wonderful. You gave us so much information there, and lots of questions. Most of them you already dealt with or touched on during your presentation. Now it's already 3 o'clock, but let's see if we can at least cover a couple of questions. Anxiety and depression, preventive measures, you already talked about that. I will just run through this very quickly. Going through wars, loss of property, various difficulties, how can they cope? I think you touched on that. Now, here's one. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Do Muslims rely too much on religion to bail them out of mental issues or challenges, depression, whatever? Allah is always there, so we are reluctant to seek professional help. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually, and it's an astute comment. I think it's a part of the acculturation process that many religions, not just Islam. I have people who are devout Catholics who come and see me, and they see it as an utter failure that they have to come and see me because prayer should have saved me. The way I look at it, very honestly speaking, is that we may have kind of grown up to feel and think that way, and there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's the way we were developed, and it's the way we think about our religion and about Allah. But what I try to tell some patients is that maybe the way to look at it is that God has imbued humanity with the capacity to be able to help other people, to be able to develop ways of outreach, to be able to develop ways of therapy, to be able to develop medications that through that God-given intelligence and that through that God-given talent and humanism, that we are therefore able to use that Islam and Allah's gifts to reach out to other people and to help them, right? And so Allah's presence there should remind us that, wait a minute, I believe that Allah created the world with the goodness in it for me to be able to benefit from, and to not look at it from the perspective of you're not helping me now, so should I turn to that? It shouldn't be mutually exclusive. It should be more of like, you're helping me by now guiding me through the knowledge I've gained to seek the help that you have now endowed other people with also to help me. I hope that makes sense, because I do have patients who are Catholics and who found it as a failure. And when I talk to them in that way, they actually felt some relief that they were not now being rejected by Christ for them or being rejected by Allah for us. Does that make sense? I hope whoever asked that it's helpful.
That is a fantastic response. I think that's excellent. Right. Okay. Where is my chat? Okay. We may have question time for just maybe a couple more. We'll see. We talked about that. Yeah. What's the chances of recurrence of depression, if you had this condition years ago and were treated for it then?
Very good. Very good question. What a lot of the studies, people who have a lot more gray hair than me that have studied these things for 50 years, 60 years, what they've found is that if a person has one serious major depressive episode, and by episode, we define it as 2 weeks. Why 2 weeks? Because a lot of the numbers and statistics show that at that point in time, if you still had this condition, a lot of people might get some conditions and recover very quickly. But if they got 2 weeks at least, they're more likely to go on for 2 months or more. So they use 2 weeks as the initial marker. Anyway, so if you've had one serious major depressive episode, within the 1 year, very quickly, you should be on treatment that first time for at least a full year of feeling well. So if it took you 2 months to get to the right point where you're saying, hey, I started the medication 2 months ago, started therapy 2 months ago, and today, 2 months later, I'm feeling like I used to, that's where you start your stopwatch. You have to stay on treatment for at least a year. At the end of that year, you can come off. Down the road, if you have another recurrence, there's about a 20% chance you may have a recurrence again. If you have a second recurrence, okay, another major depressive episode, 2 weeks or more, etc., you get treatment. The consensus is that this time, from starting the therapy and the medications and taking it until you start feeling better, you should stay on it for 2 years. Now, say you slowly come off, you wean off, and you're done. There is about a 40% chance now that you're likely to get a third episode. You get that third episode, you start the medications, the consensus this time is to stay on it indefinitely. Because stopping that, it goes from 20, 25, up to 30, 35, up to 60 to 65% chance you're likely to get a future episode beyond that third one. So the consensus is you've shown that there's a genetic vulnerability here. It's not purely because you lost your job or because you lost your job and the impact that these severe depressions have had on you. It's actually changed the way the brain is functioning and the way it's actually able to cope with these kind of psychological, psychiatric experiences, that it's left the Pandora's box open. So susceptibility to future depressive episodes increases, doubles after every episode, until after the third one, it's over 70%, and you should stay on the medication then. I hope that kind of answered it. So you should go back on medications if you had a very serious episode, and if it's recurring again, you definitely should start it up again and be on it for at least 2 years. They're also advocating now more in the US after 2 episodes just to stay on it.
Okay, final question. What are the causes of Muslims feeling depressed? What is so special about Muslims? Why are we the chosen people? Why are we
I saw that, yeah. And the part of that question, if I'm remembering the right one, we talked about, is there Islamophobia, or is part of that study? It was basically done in a particular group of people. Why Muslims? They were looking a little bit more at, part of it was the Islamophobia, absolutely. Part of it was they were looking at a lot of people who had also been emigrating and were holding on to a lot of their values. So there was that sense of being unable, the stigmatization of being able to get help. You know, that was a big part of it. Some of the groups were a little bit, this is a very good research question you're asking. Some of the people, religious groups were disproportionately represented in that group. But what was found is that religion by itself didn't protect. How religious the person was did not protect from suicide attempts. So that's an interesting point there. You know, it doesn't mean that the more religious the people were, the less likely they were to attempt. Why specifically Islam, though? It has to do with a little bit of that idea of Islamophobia in the world, but also the sense of, out of a lot of the religions, it's one of the ones that, as you've pointed out, has taken a lot of heat, you know, nationally, internationally, and so forth. And people are struggling to make an understanding and meshing with their local culture and the local environment and the secular environment around them. And that's leading to a lot of emotional distress. Also, difference between parental generation and the kids, and how that shift in acclimating to the local culture but maintaining the tradition still is a very big part of it. So I hope that answered it to some extent there.
Good points. Good points. Okay, I think we'll have to stop here. You did amazingly well. Not that you had any doubts, but you know, a lot of material, and you know, your experience and all that, you know, you drew on that, and it certainly helped. Yeah,
I appreciate it. Yeah. So I hope everybody, honestly, you know, if you have any concerns, I mean, certainly if you want my email address, you know, Nazmul, I can give it to you. But also, to be honest with you, I mean, if you speak to your family doctor, or I don't know what the system is, if you need a referral to speak to a therapist in Canada, here you could call up anybody and go. But if you were able to speak to a therapist, if you're able to speak to a psychiatrist, even share your concerns. You know, I don't prescribe a medication to everybody that walks in through the door. I mean, I really try to assess, well, where are we with this? What does it mean? What other means can we look at before we just put on a medication? Psychiatry, unfortunately, sometimes does that. You know, they over-medicalize and use too many medications. I think it depends on your fit with the person, and how well you feel you can understand where they're coming from, to be able to make that decision. But be aware of it, that the help is there. So please don't suffer needlessly if you're going through some of these terrible conditions.
Fantastic. So again, thanks for giving up your afternoon from your Sunday afternoon from the family to spend time with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Also, again, for those who are still in the audience, the recording will come out hopefully sometime during the week. Please share it with your contacts, family members, friends within the community, etc., etc. Make them aware. Awareness is the key, because we don't want people to suffer in silence and not seek help, as Dr. Dattu said. So please do that. Feel free. These are all available on YouTube, our recordings. Reminder again, this was the last session for the year. Thank you for your support, for joining us, and we will be back in January. And meantime, hope you all have a happy holiday in the meantime.
Likewise, yes.
Thanks. See you all soon. Bye-bye.